Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Michael Conroy. Michael has worked in secondary education in England for 16 years. In recent years, he has set up a training company, Men at Work, and developed a training program for professionals. The aim of this is to support those working with boys and young men in unpicking, by means of systematic dialogues, the social influences, values, and beliefs which lead to sexism, misogyny, and a range of harmful behaviors. Michael is also a youth mental health trainer and is specialized in suicide prevention. Michael is based in the English Midlands but works across the UK. I welcome Michael Conroy to Savage Minds. We've had interactions over the years on Twitter. When I say something like that, it makes it sound like we've flamed at each other, but we've had friendly interactions on Twitter.
Yeah.
And I've noticed you're coming to the debate on gender ideology, and then you formed Men at Work. Could you tell our listeners about what Men at Work is and how did you come to form this program?
Sure. It's well, I've worked in secondary education in England for about 16 years now, and in the course of that, I've met lots of very interesting people and kind of got involved in various programs about well-being and safeguarding and child safeguarding and well-being, and that's led into various areas such as being aware of domestic abuse and the impact that has on young people, and also about issues arising between young people in schools, whether that be kind of the beginnings of coercive type control, the whole range of teenage behaviours, really, which would be familiar in most countries, I think, in that age group between 11 and 18, 11 and 19. So I've got a really strong interest in safeguarding and in being proactive in that rather than just responsive. About 6 years ago, I met some people who were delivering a program called the Freedom Program, which I don't know if you're familiar with, operates in Britain. That's for women who are in abusive relationships. It supports them in exiting those relationships, or certainly in understanding the dynamics of them. And I find that a really important time that made me reassess a lot of my own behaviour and my own thoughts, assumptions. And I'm 53 years old. I'm very late to this. But as I say, about 6, maybe 7 years ago, I suddenly realised that I needed to be much more active in critiquing masculinity and critiquing the patriarchal structure, of which I'm a beneficiary and a participant in some ways, as all men are. I just wanted to get active, and I do the best I can with the knowledge I have, which is limited, which is why I joined Twitter, to try and find wise voices, and they do exist, but of course there are many many unwise voices too, and so it's been a really the last 6 years on social media particularly has been a really tumultuous and disturbing time, understanding the nature of the conflicts around gender per se, not just about gender ideology or gender whatever it might be, just the way that we are constructed to be social men and social women by millennia of cultural codes, and the very, very differing views around that, as you will know, Julian, yourself.
Well, I was going to say, when you said you were 53, I was going to say, but what age do you identify as?
About 70, I think. Yeah. if identify means feel like, yeah.
On your site, it states that Men at Work seeks to effect real cultural change, we need to work in order to do that, we need to work imaginatively with a sense of purpose and conviction, getting to the roots of sexist views and behaviors. This means looking upstream at the values and beliefs that boys and young men are exposed to by society and enabling them to find healthy, safe, respectful, and ultimately more freeing pathways into adulthood. So, you also mentioned masculinity a moment ago. Now,
Hmm.
as you know, this gender debate is very linked to some of these terms we've just used, in that one of the major actors in this is Judith Butler, who is guilted with the task of having created the transgender narrative. That's debatable, but certainly she laid the groundwork. And in her first book, Gender Trouble, she talks about masculinity and femininity as performative valences within culture. In fact, if you recall, before 2000, when people spoke about gender, it was in reference to masculine and feminine. It wasn't in relationship to men and women. Prior to 2000, within everyday language and academic language, gender did not mean man, woman. It meant masculine, feminine. Then, when you
Mm.
mention masculinity in terms of your work at Men at Work, I'm thinking, okay, what does this mean? Because gender is a social construction. Hence, when I lived in the southern parts of Morocco and there were Sahrawiya there, you would find men wearing kahol in their eyes, like an eyeliner, and long flowing
Yeah.
robes. In the Western context, this is feminine, not masculine. Conversely, in Morocco, when women are decked out in large fitting, wide fitting jalaba to not reveal their bodily contours, which is not at all the tight fitting clothing that women in the West wear. In fact, women would view Moroccan women as not so feminine when at least they're
Mm.
on the streets outside of their homes. So masculine and feminine are as much about vestiture as they are about performance, as they are about culture. So when you say masculinity, I also understand that you're not referring to that you're referring to the negative valences associated with masculinity that many feminists say male violence, masculine privilege, or male privilege. How can we understand masculinity if it is going to be in the feminist terms? And I shouldn't globalize feminism because there are feminists who critique this. I just watched Germaine Greer the other day on this, and she does critique this kind of tethering a feminist discourse to a hatred of the masculine. But how can we understand what masculinity is without imprisoning it to this space of always guilty? The way that masculinity can maybe have some kind of life that's apart from even being tethered to male bodies and being tethered to criminality, for instance.
Yeah, really interesting question. My fundamental position is that masculinity is antithetical to humanity, to a complex and inclusive humanity that is available to both male and female human beings. So masculinity in my usage, and you know, language is not uniformly understood. We just need to use our terms consistently and be prepared to explain them. So I'm happy to do explain my use of the word masculinity there, which is a code or a set of codes which give privilege, which impose restrictions, and which place boundaries on the behaviour of male humans. So masculinity is a kind of is a method of collective socialization of males to sustain patriarchal condition, and it's all masculinity doesn't exist unless we consider it as a contrast with femininity. Both of these things can become untethered from physical bodies because they're never part of them. They were never part of them. They've just been imposed upon them. So yeah, women can perform things which are typically masculine, and vice versa. Men can do things which are, you know, whether it be clothing or any kind of habitus, really, which is traditionally connected with femininity. But as you rightly point out, Julie, that depends where you are in the world and also when you are in the world, because masculinity and femininity are not constants. They're completely shift. They evolve and they shift in terms of what they look like. But the function is always to be mutually contrastive. And so the function of any masculinity in most cultures that I'm aware of, I do not have comprehensive knowledge of all human culture. I will say that very clearly. But what I am aware of, whether in the current world or in through history, through the lens of historians, is that the code of masculinity has been one which is not certain, which is intended not to be in the best interests of women, but it's also, I believe, not in the best genuine interests of male human beings, men in short term. So yeah, it's I use the word masculinity to mean the codes of behavior, expectations, permissions, and limitations, and privileges that come with those that are routinely and traditionally attached to males of the human species, but which, because they are conceived antithetically to femininity, are by their nature inhuman. And I think not in the long-term interests of the human species to sustain. So that's what I mean. I don't mean that the problem is with language, as you know, is that people, if you get 20 people talking about the same thing, they understand different things by really basic terms. And as you say, gender is used interchangeably by the same individuals as sex. They just don't reflect upon it, or it depends on the context. Government institutions use the word gender when they really mean sex. And in the past, say in the 1940s and 50s, that might not have really mattered, because just about everybody understood it as a full synonym of sex. So when it was asking for gender, it meant sex. But then with the arising of the discourse around gender in the 70s, 80s, 90s onwards, increasingly so now, the choice of word is a political act, whether you're conscious of it or not. So by masculinity, I mean codes of behavior and not material beings.
My mind drifts towards this notion then of femininity, because if masculinity is that which you align with men in all the negatives, let's say, many feminists would counteract that by saying femininity is as much a problem. The obligation that from the womb, I was supposed to somehow like ribbons and dolls. I didn't. I wanted a G.I. Joe when I was a kid. I played cowboys and Indians. But these are the things that I played hockey on the streets of Ontario, Canada, with the boys. To the detriment of my brother, at a certain age, I far exceeded his capacity in hockey, which meant that he was teased because his sister played better. So I skip back to a talk Greer gave in 2018. I believe it was an interview on Newsnight, where she talks about the problem of women's struggles today is being pitted in terms of what men do. And she has great empathy, much like what your organization is seeking out, to understand what men are facing, because she sees the problem isn't that men original sin. In fact, she criticizes feminists who demonize men, who demonize the penis, who maintain that rape is the absolutely worst thing that could ever happen to you. She says, I was raped. It wasn't the worst thing that happened to me. And she goes off and she makes comparisons. She says men are conscripted into armies. I mean, you look at child soldiers in the South Sudan. Is that a better life sentence than what she calls, Greer calls this a fuck? That's what she called rape, okay? Now, agree or disagree with Greer, there are issues that she raised that I think do get sidestepped by some, if not many, feminists. And that comes back to the way that masculinity is demonized, femininity as well, but we're not looking at the structures that create masculinity and femininity, right? Why are boys being applauded for, let's say in Canada, they are encouraged to play hockey, and every parent who sends their child to play hockey knows quite well they're sending their kid to get into fights, because hockey, post-1970s Canada, is much more about the fights that happen on the ice rink than the actual game itself. And I've talked to parents in Canada who get very worried about sending their kids to play high school hockey because they know that might result in their child losing teeth. So we've got this double matrix of where gender is here. We know it's a social construct, and we know that it's foisted upon boys and girls, both masculinity and femininity, mind you. On the other hand, we know the reality of that tends to be deadly for women in terms of domestic violence, right? How do we get to the bone marrow here of where gender is both a social construction and a material reality on the political front in terms of domestic violence?
Things. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. I don't believe in the metaphysical, but I know that they have material impacts. I don't, money is an abstract concept with material impact. Gender is an abstract concept which is inculcated, but it has multiple material impacts. I don't see there's no contradiction in that for me. In that, if we were to concoct a political notion today, just between us, that was absolutely wildly absurd, but that had certain implications for some groups of people, and it gained currency and traction socially, then our ideas that we just cooked up almost for a laugh would they have material impact. It might be to the detriment of huge numbers of people. So yeah, that I'm not entirely sure whether I took the point was that how do we balance the facts that on the one hand gender is a social construction, on the other it has at times lethal material impact. Have I took the meaning right?
Well, yes, absolutely. And the fact that, let's just take it a step further, I acknowledge, as do most people, that domestic violence vastly affects women far more than men. In fact, the minuscule numbers of men who are victims of domestic violence at the hands of women are generally not killed because of it, where the inverse is true. However, many people, including the likes of Jordan Peterson, I'll bring him up here, would say that there's a larger social matrix to be assessed. Let's begin with the way that parents, including mothers, raise boys, right? Because these notions of masculinity do come historically to us and culturally to us, but we repeat them. So it's my role as a mother to teach my child, you don't hit, right? And my role as a mother to teach my child, my daughter, that wearing a dress is not obligatory for her to be accepted by her mates, because skip 2 years back, I sent her to school with trainers she chose. And at school, they made fun of her because she was wearing boys' trainers. Well, how do you get out of that? Because, they were dark blue with an orange swoosh. And let's go beyond the fact of Nike and the political conundrum it creates in Southern Asia. But the fact is that she knew at the age of 6 that somehow, I'm putting "new" in quotes here, that she was wearing boys' trainers. And I had to explain to her that they're just trainers. So the codifying of gender, be it toxic masculinity or super fluffy white kitten wanting to have children femininity, is imposed upon children. And while I see the devastating effects of masculinity and femininity, I can't separate those effects from the way that we, as men and women and boys and girls, reproduce that. What is the way out of reproducing that? Obviously, your 10 dialogues for boys and young men and those working with them, the program that Men at Work has implemented, is one answer. And it's a great answer. In fact, I'm wondering if your 10 dialogues was a response to Jordan Peterson's list in his book. And
no.
Okay. And also, aside from programs like yours, how can the average person listening to us understand their involvement in reproducing the social myths of gender? And I mean beyond the transgender debate, mind you. I'm talking about the fact that I'd even say that there are myths about domestic violence. I give you an example. Same-sex domestic violence amongst lesbian couples is as high as it is for heterosexual couples. This is an inconvenient truth that a lot of feminists do not wish to address. Now, I had this discussion with Magdalene Burns, and she said to me, but women are not killed by their female spouses. True. And that's largely because their female partners or spouses are not double their size. So if we're not looking at death, but we're looking at violence itself, just violence, is it such, Michael, that boys are more prone to violence? Or is it that violence is affecting death because of the size differential between men and women? Therefore, women, according, and I'm giving you an MRA line here, and I'm playing the devil's advocate, that women too are violent. Women too have other forms of, let's say, emotional violence, which is what the MRAs would say. What can you speak to about the way that violence is taught to young boys and men, where you don't see this as being taught to young girls and women?
Well, just to restate exactly what you just said, violence is taught to boys and young men in a way that it isn't taught to girls and women. That is a fundamental historical truth. Certainly, the cultures of which I'm aware, there may be some around the globe where that is not the case, but certainly in the Anglosphere and in the Western European cultures with which I'm most familiar. I spent time in Italy, France, Spain, the States. That is how we are brought up. Those are the toys we're given with. Those are the heroes we have. Those are the responses we're told are appropriate. You just go back. You were talking about playing hockey. Sort it out in the playground. Stand up. Not stand up for yourself, but in the sense of knock him out. Don't stand for that. Man up. Grow a pair. This is a bombardment of instruction on how to be the social iteration that is supposed to be appropriate for your sex. So fundamentals, truth, perhaps banal, boys are taught that violence is a response to challenge. It's an appropriate response, as is anger. But at the same time, other responses are not appropriate, such as becoming, sad, upset, talking about that. I'm not somebody who fetishizes crying, because I think manipulative and abusive people can cry at will. I don't think tears necessarily equal a liberation, but they certainly are part of a healthy human existence, and should be, expressed as and when the authentic feeling arises. So I would suggest that anybody listening to this spend some time in a toy shop or a shop that sells birthday cards and just start looking. Just kind of try and enter with an open mind. Say, what messages are being transmitted here to boys of 2, 3, 4, 5 years old and girls of 2, 3, 4, 5 years and onwards? Why do we know instinctively which clothes, which toys, which books, which birthday cards, which whatevers are for who? And we have to just start to unpeel the layers of our own assumptions, which are really difficult because normality is normality, for whatever that is for an individual. But we just have to enter with a critical spirit, look at the places and the moments where young children are introduced to what is expected. I'm going to move because somebody's drilling in the next room. Sorry about that. Just in case the drill comes through the wall, going to shift. So yeah, I've gone on websites with children, young lads, young girls as well, actually in some mixed cases, and just looked at toy store websites, looked at the messaging, the words that are on T-shirts, and then just to give a small understanding of the processes of inculcation, of indoctrination, and of separation, because the separation of male and female as types of human beyond the physical is the fundamental goal of patriarchy, as I understand it, is to show that we have collective common ground in terms of our abilities, what is appropriate for us, what we should expect as men, and women have other things, and that is beyond physical. And that plays out in later relationships because of our expectations of what is our right, what is our birthright, in a sense, socially and culturally. Um, and that may well be to have the last word, to be dominant, be the man of the house.
Watching what is being sold to children, even adolescents, the kind of video games or virtual reality games that boys play as opposed to girls is starkly different for sure. I would also venture to say, I've written about this, in fact, try to buy a girl anywhere over the age of, well, from birth onward, actually, a t-shirt or a shirt that does not have something on it that's akin to love, hearts. There are shirts, so many that say, love me. And I have a hard time buying clothes for my daughter because I don't want her to be a walking billboard of quote unquote femininity. And this idea that she exists only as a piece that needs to fit into a masculinist vision puzzle. And you go to the boys section of the shirts, they get great shirts. I do buy my daughter a lot more of these boys shirts, not the ones that have cars on them, not the gun, whatever, or superhero ones, but I do get her the ones with dinosaurs on them. I think they're far more interesting. I've written t-shirt companies. I've said, why can't you make this line for girls? You have great products, they're well built, but really flowers and hearts, unicorns, look, come on, let's get real. And in fact, you'll notice that girls clothes have an enormous branding towards imaginary creatures like unicorns and rainbows. Well, rainbows are real, but come on. So girls are always put into that frame of desire for the male subject viewing her. Boys are put into a frame of action and empowerment and authenticity. Girls are always, their clothes, their toys are about fitting into a cultural objective. So, when I see the changes happening over the past 30 years of marketing towards boys and girls, it has gotten worse, not better. In the 1970s, when I was growing up and when you were also a child, it was great. It was the era in the US and in Canada. There was Marlo Thomas, who had this initiative, Free to Be You and Me. It was also an album, a record of songs that was participated in by many stars to basically undo gender. And this came at the heels of, Gloria Steinem and all the other feminists of that ilk. Now we've gone backwards, and it's a clear backwards. Now, some people will say, but Margaret Thatcher, and then this is where I step back to Germaine Greer, because she says very clearly in her 2018 interview, we need to be questioning the structures. Why are we applauding when women get into a certain armed service that heretofore was barred from? And now we're supposed to say, oh, now that's equality. We should be asking not why women aren't in that, but why that even exists. These are the masculinist visions: war, conscription, bombardments. Look at what's happening in Yemen. The fact that I find myself on my wall currently on Facebook, go there. There's a current debate about Trump being worse than Biden. And I'm like, they're both bad. And Biden having a 50-year-long record of voting for, signing off on acts that have killed millions between Iraq and Afghanistan, that have involved the displacements of tens of millions of people. Think of Yemen, think of South Sudan, think of Syria and beyond, because he was alive and voting during the Iran-Contra affair and during just the Contra affair itself and the US involvement in Central American despots from El Salvador to Nicaragua to Honduras, skip down the border. I mean, it goes on and on. So we're talking about devastation that's affected by POTUS number idiot, Trump, and then the new guy. I find these discussions of who's better or worse for women or for Black people, frankly, useless, because we're not looking at the larger structural problems. Can you speak to us about how Men at Work is addressing masculinity, both in your program and even some of the discussions that you do have with young men and boys? about the pressures they face. Because what I think is missing, and this is, hate me for saying it, but I think what the feminists are missing out is empathizing with the state in which men and boys, especially boys, are put growing up, because I don't see that they have a ripcord to a parachute out of this quite easily, which is why I'm very impressed with your program and others who are trying to address the kind of subjectivity that boys are put into. Are they really patriarchal figures at the age of 8, being told that they can do anything, for instance? Are they really oppressors of girls because they are given pats on the back for pulling a girl's hair ribbons, for instance? What are the ways that boys and men are struggling to exit from this very toxic socialization?
Okay. th- the point and my goal in the work that I do is to have very frank, honest conversations with groups of young men, um, aimed at raising consciousness collectively and reciprocally as well, because I think any facilitator of any work like this has to be absolutely open to shift their own thinking and not see themselves as a transmitter of some kind of hypodermic truth against which they are insulated. But the idea is to raise consciousness, to create space to think critically about what it means to be a boy, a young man, in a world which has very fixed expectations that go back generations, and to be conscious of oneself, to be conscious of the dynamics between peers who may be male or female, and looking forward into later life, being conscious of the impacts of our behavior on women and girls and on other boys and men. Um, it, so I would say that raising consciousness, instilling curiosity, working on understanding what empathy feels like, looks like, and how we would apply it practically in a range of situations is an, a reasonable and important and necessary thing to do with boys and young men, and it doesn't happen. That is why I do what I do, because I see an absolute gap in the UK school system. These conversations do not take place. That's the fundamental spur for what I do. I'm trying to do something which currently does not happen in a systematic way. And so that's a kind of slightly prosaic critique of the UK English and Welsh education system. But I would be surprised that if in France or Portugal or Ghana or New Zealand, there were meaningful conversations held by professionals who work with boys and young men over time about the component parts of the cultural ideal of masculinity to which they are exposed. I think I think those conversations tend to happen in response to incidences which have arisen, and I think we've got to move way past that kind of reactive sticking plaster, merely punitive approach to dealing with multiple manifestations of violence. So I've created a program. There may be others around the world, and may even be others in the UK, and that's great. But we really need to have national and international conversations about how do we have systematic conversations that are meaningful and respectful and collaborative with boys and young men about how to navigate life safely for them, and how we can, in our navigation of our lives, be safe to be around. Because these are fundamental things. We want to be safe. We want other people to be safe. And it's clear that by refusing to critique patriarchal structures, that is never going to happen. So in an ad hoc way, I've kind of devised this program, which I deliver every week with boys and teenage boys, in my small way. It's tiny. I'm making no great claims for this. It's tiny, but it is gathering some interest because there is a huge lack of something which is not ad hoc and which is not responsive and which is not, sorry, reactive, and which has got a strategic understanding of how the messages of society do, coalesce into a worldview which is not necessarily in the best interests of boys and young men, or indeed, the women and girls in their lives, whether they're straight or gay, actually, as well. This is not a purely hetero centric approach. This is for any young man.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. Well, I'm thinking too, the 1968 British film with Malcolm McDowell, If. I remember when I saw that, I had not yet lived in the UK, but it struck me to the core because in that film, you see the toxicity of masculine culture amongst men or boys themselves. How does that situation, which according to friends of mine who had been in schools just like that, this was a reality and continued. It was sort of a legacy, a pecking order to establish males amongst themselves. We see this on the football pitch. We see this in corporate spaces. We also see women fighting that, what they call the glass ceiling, to be just like that. So we're seeing that masculinity isn't something that only men do to each other, but now women strive for in that quote unquote feminism that they activate. How can we maybe understand better the relationship between this form of masculinity as boys are inculcated and the ways in which those messages have become sort of larger social messages of success? For women to succeed, they must be dog eat dog, let's go and get to the top of that pyramid. In a way, I'm asking you to make a critique of how masculinity intersects with capitalism.
That's the that's a really good question, obviously, and in some cases it's a very fundamental question. Yeah, I guess we have to understand what we mean in a sense about the values of capitalism, which are kind of individualistic. They're non-collaborative. They emphasize extraction, exploitation, maximization of profit, which sidelines and suppresses more communitarian values and objectives and priorities. So yeah, they sit very nicely together. I'm not expert enough to talk about the historical link, or to speculate that masculinity as a negative framing of male existence cannot or has not ever existed beyond capitalism, because I suspect that it has, certainly in the modern form of capitalism. So I'm not going to pretend to be a historical expert in the parallel development of masculinity as we know it now and capitalism as we know it now, but I will say that I can see a huge amount of interdependence. There's huge similarities in the marginalization of empathy. In fact, empathy is irrelevant to capitalism. You could even say it's antithetical to capitalism, despite the efforts of major corporations to come across as being caring, which is usually just another marketing ploy, or as they read the slight developments in culture, and they try to be ahead of those curves or to profit from them effectively. So yeah, capitalism marginalizes the aspects of humanity which I believe are our best, which are empathy, collaboration, and and sustainability. And masculinity does the same. It prioritizes the male social presence, the male need, over that of women and girls. And to do that, to sustain masculinity, you do need to really bypass empathy. You have to actively propagandize against empathy, and that takes us back to our toys and our fairy stories and our t-shirts and all of that stuff that children encounter as they begin to walk through the world. They're surrounded by messages everywhere, the visual language and the grammatical one as well. Just to recap, I think what I'm saying is that, yeah, masculinity, capitalism both rely on the suppression of what is best in humans.
We view masculinity and this, let's call it male culture, as something to be dealt with. But I don't think that we can deal with that without also assessing the other side in the way that women are part of that, in the way that we participate in it. We want to climb up that masculinist ladder of power. We raise our boys to be brutes. I'm not saying all of us, and I'm not even saying most of us, because I think most parents, men included, try to raise their children to do the right thing, as it were. But as many parents will tell you, and I was told this before I had my kids, it's stronger than you think. You can say no to the Barbie dolls, but they're going to come back and ask until you break down and get them the damn Barbie doll, in terms of girls. And the boys will do the same thing. So it seems that culture is a very large force to be reckoned with, but at the same time, parents are the ones raising their kids. Is there a way that parents can collectively push back against the pink rows of toys on the shelves and the guns for boys and the various gimmicks that show boys that they're nothing but agents of reciprocal capital wealth?
Sure, there are. First, I just wanted to pick on something and I'll come back to that in terms of practical action that parents, carers, and family can take. But just something you're talking about, that speaking up thing. But in the UK, the rape has been virtually decriminalised here, by de facto decriminalised. There are barely any prosecutions. It's like 0.5 reports in prosecution. So the onus there, I don't see that on girls and women. I see the onus there on the judiciary, which is a function of the patriarchal state, to get its fucking act together and to be deeply, properly, thoroughly overhauled. That's where I see the onus. So I don't place any onus or guilt or blame on the speaking up or not at any particular point, whether in the moment or years later, because what you're looking at is a machine that really simply doesn't give a fuck.
So you think that most women who don't report sexual assault and rape are not doing so because they are already defeated with the knowledge that it will go nowhere, and they will lose days of their lives, if not months and years, in a process that will leave them without anything?
I'd say that's the truth for a huge number of women. I mean, the other week I was in a webinar, and a young woman was speaking, and she'd been raped, and her father was a senior policeman in London, and they spent, I think, a week talking about it all day, every day. Really, really, he was trying to advise what was best. He was saying, "I'll support you in every way." They really thought, and the outcome of his knowledge, as well of the internal workings of the judiciary and the CPS, the Crime Prosecution Service, and what his daughter would go through. I mean, they collectively decided not to proceed with that, and that's a really damning just single instance. But the statistics on rape reporting and prosecution in the UK are, one couldn't read from them that there is a serious machinery to support rape victims. You could only assume the contrary. So that, I just wanted to pick up on that point specifically, is I would always place the onus on on the man who decides to rape, and B, on the men, usually, but not always, but usually the men in the CPS, the police, and the judiciary who fail women and girls multiply thereafter. In terms of the broader involvement of women in articulating, I suppose, or sustaining patriarchy or misogynistic values or sexism or stereotypes more broadly. Well, we are all born into the world we're born into, and I think we all are expected and pressurized to believe what is convenient and suitable and expedient for us to believe, and we're exposed to multiple kind of coercive forces, however subtle they may be, to do that. So yes, women seeking to be the CEO of banks or mining companies is basically just, or field marshals or generals or whatever it may be. It is exactly as you say, it is just a rebranding, a reframing of a patriarchal structure, which is, male-centric for centuries, millennia. It indicates some kind of change, but I think I agree with you, is that it doesn't indicate any form of challenge to the structure, and the structure is hierarchical, it is extractive, and it's capitalistic. So it could be the case that all women, all CEOs of all petrol companies or mining companies were women, and some people might see that as a fantastic thing. But if they're still doing what they do, which is derives from that template of centuries old kind of patriarchal domination, then there is no revolution there. There is no change. There is merely a kind of a respray, which I think we're on the same track there. I believe, like Margaret Thatcher, somebody I was familiar with as a youngster. She was my prime minister at the time. Lots of things about female politicians is often they draw out a lot of misogyny in men who seem to be very right on. It's particularly right-wing female politicians. It's not long before critiques of them from men to become sex-based and reveal a certain misogynistic kind of approach to women per se, and they're often very glad to be able to vent their ire and their spleen at women who they think they're allowed to be misogynistic towards because they're of a different political persuasion. But they wouldn't be like that to left-wing women or liberal women. They're only like that to right-wing women. And we've all seen that on Twitter, and that spills over into the whole TERF thing as well, where I'm a good guy, I just hate these women. You're thinking, mate, you don't. You just hate women, and you are ringing the bells of joy because you found a way of doing that publicly. So I don't criticize women for seeking positions of influence and power and high remuneration within the structure we have, but I reserve the right to say I don't think it's a transformative sign in and of itself, and that it may, in fact, in some cases, divert attention from harmful natures of the structure in which they appear to be taking power.
In the follow-up of human rights abuses in many countries, and I'm thinking to Rwanda, there was a system called the Gacaca courts. And this was used because of the court system being backlogged with human rights abuses in terms of death, that they took on a lot of the rapes in these courts. These were more informal systems that were used to give recognition to the victims that something had been done to her. And I've thought about this over the years, especially since Greer's vituperation of the court system and the way that rapes are very unlikely to ever be prosecuted because we need evidence to convict someone. Might there be a more social environment like the Gacaca courts of Rwanda that could be set up in countries like the UK, in other countries as well, where there could be a dialogue where women can face the person who raped them and the person who raped them can face their accuser and have some kind of, albeit less penal system of dealing with rape. Because part of me is thinking, yes, rapes are a reality, and it's a sad reality that we all have to have that discussion with our daughters when they're old enough to inform them about how to handle dealing with men in a presence that is secluded, on a date, you name it. Many rapes, as Germaine Greer also points out, most, she says, occur within marriage. And we know that rape wasn't even conceded as a crime within marriage in the United States until the 1980s. I believe it was 1984. In the UK, it was even later. So, how do we assess violence when it's been systemically imposed upon women within marriage, let's say, within the date rape, right? Well, you were on a date, or you're reckoning of being in Italy. There was a famous case in Italy where a woman was found to have not been raped. Guess why? She wore jeans, right? This was Naples. Go figure. So if you wear jeans, well, you're asking for it. And we've seen this over the recent 50 years of history of women being made into the victim a second time through the court system. Might it be even more instructive for boys and men to know that if they rape, that instead of the unlikelihood that they will ever face a prosecutor or a judge, that there would be a likelihood that they would face a cachacha type system?
As a man, I would never suggest, I cannot comment, and I would not comment on fundamental change to the way that rape is dealt with in the country that I live in, because all I see is deep, absolute, and intentional failure. So I don't think. I'm just thinking about Derek Chauvin. I mean, he needs the accountability which is being visited upon him finally, which is extremely rare. The accountability has to be a demonstration that the legal system, as it stands, works and is in the interests of all citizens. I don't think one could say, why don't we have a different system? Because this one's fucked up. This doesn't work. Why don't we have a different one where Derek Chauvin meets George Floyd's family? I don't know. I don't feel that. That doesn't resonate with me in any way. I say, let's fix the legal system, make it work.
And I do wonder if we're addressing crimes against women in an appropriate way. Now, what your organization is doing, to me, is the answer. Why deal with crimes when we can deal with the root of the crimes? We can deal with the root of violence. Can you speak to us about some of the cases of boys and young men that you deal with, the pressures they face to reproduce what the feminists might call toxic masculinity? Because I think it's really unclear to some men who might be listening to this how masculinity is put into the blueprint of their lives from day one.
Sure. I think I've probably worked over time, like rather than just as one-off sessions, which I've done a lot of as well, which I try and avoid now. I've probably worked with 300 young men, I would say, in the last 5 years. Things that have arisen, they really cover the spectrum of tracking this thing called collective socialization through masculinity. Simple start. Young men in England, when you're in year 9, so you're about 13, you choose your subjects that you're going to specialize in, usually 7, 8 things called GCSEs. Used to be called O levels, and they're the things that you're going to study for the rest of your school time. Quite a few young boys have said that their choices were influenced by the perceived masculinity or femininity of the subject matter, which means that, and then you start talking to teachers of art, music, drama, and foreign languages, French, Italian, Spanish, German, tends to be the case in England. And they go off a cliff, and then go off a further cliff at the age of 16 when you finish your first round of compulsory education, and then you move on to the second round, which is called sixth form. You do it A levels in England, and that's usually 16 to 18 education. And barely any young men do art, drama, music. Barely any young men do modern foreign languages. Simple, just a simple. That's not killing anybody. It's not brutal. It's not viscerally kind of noteworthy, but it tells a real story. There is something about culture transmitting messages to those boys and young men, either through their families or through their friends or through a complex of all of those things, that tell them that expressive modes are not appropriate for boys and young men. That's one part of it. Okay, so it's a part of that there. People are dissuaded from being expressive and artistic. And therefore they choose whatever physics, engineering, men's subjects in inverted commas. And that's come across a lot. I've come across that more times than I ever thought I would, but that's the thing. I'll go right to the other end of the spectrum. No, I'll go to the middle of the spectrum first. I remember last year I spoke to a young man who's 15, difficult, underprivileged, disadvantaged, chaotic home life. His mum had a heroin problem and was not at the scene. His dad was in and out of prison. He wasn't in the scene. So he's brought up by his uncle, decent guy, ex-military, by all accounts, the teachers who knew this young man said he was, his uncle turned up for parents' evening. He was interested. No worries, no fears. He was fed. He took part in sports. He had friends. He was looked after. But in a conversation with the young man, we were talking about clothes, some of this pink blue bullshit that we've mentioned earlier, these kind of very gross, crass indicators of gender allegiance or affiliation. And he said that he wasn't allowed to wear colours. He could only wear black, white or blue because his uncle, being of this kind, he said it's because he's an ex-military, he said he doesn't like soft colours. And this lad had once bought a T-shirt that I think was kind of an orangey colour, maybe tangerine, the taboo territory for young men. And his uncle had said, "Take that off. I'll buy you 2 new ones." And so he took it off, and he said, "Here's some money. Go and get 2 new ones." Give him like way too much money to correct, in his mind, what was wrong clothing for a 15-year-old boy because it was effeminate, I don't know, gay, I don't know. These are the things, aren't they? These are the connotations. They're rarely spelt out, and it suits a lot of people to leave them at the level of intuition, that subliminal kind of understanding that is often not articulated. It may be, but this young guy, he knew we were looking at T-shirts for girls and boys and what the difference was and why some people would buy this for a girl, that for a boy, and he knew it. He got it intellectually, but he was in a situation where he owed a debt of thanks, he felt, and respect and gratitude to his uncle, who was bringing him up in a way that he thought was appropriate and proper. And he probably meant no harm, but that meaning no harm doesn't mean that you do not enact restrictive and kind of very narrow and quite depressing sort of modes of expression. But he was worried that his nephew, would attract criticism perhaps from other men on the grounds of wearing colourful clothing, that he was not sufficiently masculine, he wasn't man enough. And now I'm thinking, or I was thinking at the time, is it really fear for him, or is it fear for the uncle, that it would reflect on his ability to reproduce masculinity? And that's a fucking heavy conversation at 10 o'clock in the morning with a 15-year-old lad. The debt of gratitude, the social power, the immensity of the history of that, and the absurdity of fearing colour because what? How has colourful attire become inextricably linked in some cases, and there are intersections of class here as well. I'm not unaware of that. And at age, how have we got to the point where we are so Pavlovian that basic things like colour will send us off into a tailspin? So I've talked about subject choice. That's like quite a banal, simple thing, and yet speaks volumes, I think. That also speaks about lack of authenticity, is that you are trained into being an inauthentic person, in that you are choosing things which are not your choice, but which you defer to the knowledge or the knowledge of or the threat from others, perhaps about what you want to do, how you want to study, learn, play, whatever it may be. Then we get onto the clothing thing, which I thought strange example, but I think again very telling. And then others, I've had a couple of young men who've been told to fight, not just sent to do a sport where they might fight. They've been told to fight to settle family disputes at 14, 15, and that's hard. That's hard to talk to. That's hard to unpick because people love their parents. We love mostly. Mostly we love our parents and carers. So we are conflicted when they ask us to do things, which I think these young lads, they knew it was not the right thing to do, but it's the thing that was expected of them. So these conversations can throw up all kinds of everything. And the small things you can talk about in great detail. Talk about the coloured T-shirt. I talk about that with other groups, and they go, yeah, wait a minute, that reminds me. And then you've got an in. It's finding the small drill holes into the bigger thing. Sorry for pointing at the camera. It's finding those. That is the joy of the work, if I can use that word, in that it's about joining dots. It's about peeling away layers of assumption, peeling away layers of, but that's just normal, isn't it? And giving the boys and the young men the ability there, and it sort of creates a space in a block, and then the light can start to come in, and then they can think, well, you know what? I will hesitate next time I'm in that situation, or I'm going to do that differently. And that's the hope. The problem with preventative work is, of course, you can't quantify it, and it's very difficult to persuade politicians to take on board, because what they want, certainly in England, is they want to stand on the House of the Commons and say, we've achieved an 8% reduction in X. Now, you can do that with some things, but you can't do that with things that haven't happened.
It reminds me of the recent Everyone's Invited online site, where now over 15,000 women, girls have added their testimonies as to sexual violence, bullying, scapegoating, etc., at public and private schools in the UK. Going back to If with Malcolm McDowell, you said there's a class issue here as well. But I'm thinking to a night years ago, a politician from London took me out for drinks, and she told me about the Bullingdon Club. I had no idea what that was. So we see that it affects all echelons of class and wealth and poverty. Of course, it affects itself in different ways. And it's also masked by the wealthier. They can get away with it because so many of them are currently in our government, right? I wonder if someone listening to this might say, well, those are colors of shirts. How does that relate to sexual violence against women and girls?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Really good question. Well, also the boys that I talk to are basically watching porn from the age of 10, 9, could reel off 40 different categories from Pornhub. They get little to no sex education in school. They are playing GTA at the age of 10. So this is an interesting, horrible detail. Like last week, I took my kids up north to where I'm from, and we stayed in an apartment in quite a rough part of the town that I grew up in. And there were some women who seemed to be involved in prostitution, walking around these streets. And my daughter saw one, and she said, it's like GTA. That's what all the women in GTA walk like. And that really struck me. that is, well, GTA's got about 40 million copies sold, I think, in its last iteration. God knows how many tens of millions of boys have grown up playing that and Call of Duty, etc. So to come back, it's not just about colours of shirts. These are just tiny ways into conversations about the power of expectation. And the power of expectation applies to modes of dress. It applies to what degree you might do, what kind of job you think is appropriate. It also applies to your sexual behavior. which is taken from a script which is incredibly pornified. If you look at the work of Gail Dines, she's way more eloquent than I ever will be on that front. So we teach boys and young men to occupy a social space through an absolutely wildly diverse battery of means, whether it is toys, jokes, songs, music, films, heroes, the whole thing, and personal, known models like fathers, brothers, uncles, neighbours, family, friends, politicians. Everything you see in here, everything we see in here, we are influenced by, and we I think there's a process. It's called interpellation. I think to drag that back from about 20 years ago at university. Something that calls to us, I believe it is, isn't it? And that we feel called by. I might need to revisit that term because it's very relevant, obviously, to masculinity and the socialization of boys and young men. But yeah, it isn't just about t-shirts. It's just an interesting and tiny way in to look. It's like seeing the world in a grain of sand, if that's not too corny. It's about the power of social norms and the gains and the cost, because you gain 2 t-shirts, you lose the one you want. You gain the endorsement and the embrace of those around you, but you lose your authenticity, your individuality. You could apply that to any situation, I think. But yeah, other boys and young men I've been involved in things like county lines, which is a criminal phenomenon in England. It may exist elsewhere, but it's where, because I'm in a sort of semi-rural area, it's where boys with no criminal record, it's mainly boys actually, usually about 14, 15, are recruited by much bigger criminals from bigger towns because they're kind of clean skinned and they're not known by the police. So they get recruited into moving drugs, weapons, things like that, through a process of appeals to machismo. In some cases, it's actually a part of it. It tends not to be a direct threat, but they do come later, because often some of the young lads I've worked with have taken on a job, maybe to move something from somewhere not very far, a mile. They might be offered £50 or £100, but they'll be mugged on that first ever trip, and then they're in debt to their employer, inverted commas. But the appeal is to, don't be a pussy. You're a guy, you're a man. You can do this. Come on, it's easy. And that is the appeal to the training that we've had in how to be a man. So there's this just total and utter interweaving of the expectations, the demands, and the rewards of masculinity. And that's really what the work I do is to talk about that, unpick it, and give thinking space, and hopefully give the ability to resist and to delegitimize that amongst their peers and any kids that they may have in future.
One thing that came up for me in the debates over transgender prisoners in women's prisons, men in women's prisons, was this. When you look at the statistics of who's being killed in the US, in the UK, around the world, most of the victims of male violence are males. And I think women need to understand the enormous depth of violence that's done both symbolically, within culture and families and education as well, in order to come to some kind of productive measures that we can take even together. So you're having discussion with young men and boys about the histories that they face, their heritage, their standing in the world, especially now, lockdown. They are more than ever, boys in England are going to face hell to get a job. Will they face an easier time of getting a job than women? That's not bearing out when you see the numbers of girls in higher education are far higher than those of boys. Is there perhaps, in what you're dealing with these men and boys, a resonance, an aftertaste of a culture that hasn't completely digested the fact that women and girls have equal rights, and there's some kind of resentment that's lingering there?
Oh, I would agree with that. that there is a backlash against against the acquisition of rights, whether they're fully equal or not. I think is probably because a right is only equal if you can exercise it, and you know, if you don't have a satisfactory response from the people from whom you seek recourse, like to go back to the case of rape and sexual assault in the UK, then the right is abstract and notional, and rights have to be lived, and they have to be exercisable and exercised fully for them to have any sense, because otherwise they're just something. It's like having a policy it's like having a fire policy in a government, in an organization, but nobody knows where the policy is, and all the exits are blocked. You know, you could say, yeah, we've got a policy, but it's the same with rights. Is if you can't exercise them, or when you try to exercise them, you encounter extraordinary kind of resistance or just simple failure, then it's a very moot point whether the right exists even. But I would say, yeah, there is a backlash. I think a lot of porn is a backlash against women's rights. I mean, it's a reassertion of male dominance, and as such, literally and not just metaphorically, a source of propaganda. I mean, I used to think that porn was metaphorically propaganda for male supremacy. Now I think it's literally propaganda, in that its objective is to mobilize men as individuals and as groups in the suppression of women's rights. I think that is the case.
Wouldn't it be great if men could react as swiftly to women's rights as they have to the proposal of a super league?
Yeah. Oh, Jesus. Yeah. So men have been in tears. Men have been in tears and wailing and jumping on cars and talking about the betrayal of working class traditions. Even Boris himself, who couldn't give a flying fuck about football at all, or anybody, or anything apart from himself, has been pretending. I think leave him out of it. That was mere pretense. Some men seem to have been really upset, and as a kind of disinterested observer, yeah, it's capitalism gone wild, and it breaks traditions with communities. Fair enough. I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. But some men, hundreds, thousands of men online, and it have been demonstrating. And I think it would not be overly speculative to suggest that most of those men have never done that about the fact that women have to walk around with keys in their hands or get accused of inviting sexual assault, etc., etc., etc. This is what kills you, really, is that you can see the capacity for outrage, and then you see the incidence of outrage and the mismatch between what one should be outraged about and what one is outraged about. That's a real killer.